Welcome to the National Black Leadership and Empowerment Project series, Ask an Elder.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Ask an Elder. My name is Naki Franklin, and I'm a senior at North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University. Today, I'm talking to Mr. Carl Snowden, who is a civil rights activist, politician, and Annapolis, Maryland native. He is also the convener of the Caucus of African American Leaders of Anne Arundel County. So, Mr. Snowden, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
First,
thank you for the invitation as well.
Absolutely. First, you've been involved in civil rights since you were a teenager. And so will you please tell me more about the story about your boycott while attending Annapolis High School to protest the school's lack of African-American teachers and African-American studies courses, and how did that idea come about?
Well, I think context is very important. When I was a student, which has been over 50 years ago, at Annapolis High School, integration had just come to the county in which I live. The famous Brown decision was done in 1954, and it was a decision made by the powers to be that integration would come in the county in which I live 12 years later, 1966. So for African Americans who lived in Anne Arundel County, Maryland, the only school that they were allowed to attend, the only high school they were allowed to attend, was Wally H. Bates High School. That school closed in 1966, and African Americans were permitted to integrate, if you will, into Annapolis High School, which is the flagship school. When I attended the school in 1969, 1970, it was after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. He was murdered in 1968. It was after the assassination of Malcolm X, who was also assassinated in 1965. It was after the assassination of Fred Hampton, who was a member of the Black Panther Party, who was assassinated in 1969. So I'm going to Annapolis High School, and there's approximately 2,000 students at this school, 500 of them are African American. And one of the things that would occur at the school was that they would have an assembly, and we didn't have a auditorium capable of having all 2,000 students at the same time. So assemblies in sections. And so at one of the assemblies in which I attended, there was about 500 people at the assembly, and the Student Government Association president, who was white, the principal, who was white, the assistant administrator, who was white. The entire program was being run by white people. And so they brought on a country and Western performance where some people were performing country. Well, somebody in the audience shouted out, we want to hear some soul music, rhythm and blues. And the Student Government Association president responded by saying, this is our assembly. This is our program. And he finally said, and if you don't like it, you can leave. Well, he said it with such anger in his voice that a hush fell over the audience. And maybe it took me about 10 seconds for it to resonate. But I concluded he was right. If I didn't like what I was hearing and seeing, I should leave. And so I got up to leave the auditorium. It's a darkened auditorium. It's more than 500 people present. But what happened is when you get up, these seats would flap up when you got up. And so as I got up to leave, walking out of the auditorium, all of a sudden I kept hearing flap, flap, flap. And before I knew it, more than 150 Black students had joined me walking out in protest over what was going on. Once we were gathered, we decided there was time to bring about change at Annapolis High School. So we had a list of demands. And one of the demands we wanted at the time was to have the school's curriculum reflect Black studies, Black history. And we wanted to have more African American administrators and teachers and staff, et cetera. So that March, and remember I'm 15, 16 years old, that protest led to a 2-week boycott of classes where Black students would show up at school. We were boycotting classes, not school. So we would show up at school, and we had decided that what we would do is to have a teach-in where we'd learn about Black history and then teach it to our fellow students in the cafeteria. So for 2 weeks, we did that. Students would come to school, refuse to go to class, and be part of this protest. So that is what initiated this demonstration. It went on for 2 weeks. Later, the mayor of the Annapolis, the NAACP president for Annapolis, as well as other adults, came to meet with us. And the primary purpose of the meeting with us was to convince us to return to classes. They acknowledged that we had some legitimate concerns, but they thought that our protest was not being constructive. So each of these adults were telling us why we should go back to class. And the mayor gave his pitch, a president of the NAACP gave his pitch, and we as students wasn't budging, because nowhere in what they were saying, we thought, would bring about the kind of progress that we wanted. So finally, one of the speakers, a guy who was the NAACP chair of the education committee, spoke to the audience, mostly Black. And he told us that if we returned to class, all the things we wanted, we could have within 30 days. And students booed him, saying 30 days seemed like to us forever, and it was too long. He then tried to say, well, give us 3 weeks and we'll do these changes, which included more faculty members, as well as a Black Studies curriculum. And again, he was booed. He finally said, give us 2 weeks. And if we don't do this within 2 weeks, you can, quote, do your own thing, which was a popular slogan at that time. And again, the students booed him, saying 2 weeks was not long enough. But I thought about that and I said, well, 2 weeks doesn't seem like a god awful time. And so I spoke to the students and suggested that we go back to class for 2 weeks. If they were going to make these commitments that we're going to have all these things we wanted, we would do it. And we went back to class. Well, suffice it to say, they did not keep their promise. They, in effect, lied to us. And so on February 12th, 1970, which is the birthday of Abraham Lincoln, which is why this day was chosen, we decided that we're going to have a new demonstration. And this time, our goal would be never to leave go back to class until we had more written assurances that these promises were going to be upheld. So one of our students, a female student, she worked in the office of the administrator. And in those days, they had what they call mimeograph machines, where you would create leaflets through a mimeographing. And she was in and had developed this mimeograph, which talked about calling on students to not attend class on February 12th, given all the reasons why students shouldn't attend class. And her goal was to print out these leaflets so we could distribute them. But what happened was she was caught in the act of doing this by one of the staff members who took the leaflet from her. And unbeknownst to the staff member and later the principal, they did not realize that we had not been able to distribute a single leaflet. The only leaflet that we had was the one that they had confiscated. But they didn't know that. So the principal on that same day addressed the students over the public address system. As I told you, with 2,000 students. And what he said was, we understand that there's a protest being planned for February 12th. It's going to start at such and such a time. Anybody involved in participating in this protest will be disciplined. Well, he had just alerted the entire school system about the demonstration they knew nothing about. And in those days, if you told students that they couldn't do something, they did the opposite of what he did. So we had hundreds of people show up at the demonstration.
Wow.
And that's what happened.
Wow. That's so amazing. And it stuck out to me that it kind of started, not necessarily in a spur of moment, of course, because, all the incidences have been building up, but just how at the assembly, kind of just in the moment, you decided to stand up and walk out, and it created this whole movement. So that's really amazing. Thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome.
So who were some of your influences growing up? I know you've mentioned the autobiography of Malcolm X before, but just in general, who were some of your influences and why?
Well, the autobiography of Malcolm X, I credit it with helping to raise my own consciousness. I was at Annapolis High School, and an English teacher required me and other students to read the autobiography of Malcolm X. Up until that time, I didn't know who Malcolm X was. I'd never read about him. 15 years old, 16. And we were required to read 2 chapters and then come back and give an oral report on Malcolm X. And at the time I got this book, it was a kind of big book. My goal was to kind of cheat it. I was just going to read through a couple and then wing it the next day. But when I picked up the autobiography of Malcolm X, the first chapter was called Nightmare. And I literally could not put the book there. I read it from cover to cover in one setting. And what Malcolm X revealed in the autobiography was so, it had such an effect on me personally. I mean, it raised questions I had never thought of. I'm 15 or 16 years old. And one of the things I remember so vividly about the autobiography of Malcolm X was he raised the question of what color Jesus was. And I'd never thought of Jesus as being anything other than the portrait I saw on the wall of a white man. But Malcolm X so effectively helped me understand that Jesus had to be a man of color because of his origin, where he was. And I started, I was absolutely fascinated by Malcolm's ability to be able to take history and geography and to be able to teach people what their real history was. And so I was greatly influenced by Malcolm X, as I would later be influenced by Martin Luther King Jr. as well. And so I lived during an era, grew up in an era where we had living legends as part of our role models. I grew up when Muhammad Ali was a heavyweight champion of the world. I heard Nikki Giovanni. I heard Maya Angelou. I heard men and women who in today's world were considered to be giants in a respective field. I had an opportunity to interview James Baldwin and to have a face-to-face conversation with James Baldwin.
Wow.
Which I treasure, to be able to ask him questions that helped me to understand better the world I was living in. And I had all these experiences when I was a teenager. And so as a result of that, that influenced who I am today.
Wow. So I'm an English major, so definitely hearing like that you spoke with James Baldwin is amazing to me. So next, I kind of wanted to ask, You touched on this in your story about walking out in high school, but just you've organized multiple impactful groups, initiatives, events, protests. So kind of my question is, where do you usually start? What's the first step in organizing that you do? Is it different every time you're beginning to plan something? Or for example, during the high school walkout, it was you all gathered outside immediately and just began discussing. So what's kind of typically the first step in organizing?
Well, the first, of course, is to have an issue that you feel so passionate about that you're willing to organize around. So one of the things, over the years, I've obviously been involved in literally hundreds, if not thousands, of demonstrations. And all of them basically had the same spark. They desired to see something change. For me, I was against the war in Vietnam, so I participated in anti-war demonstrations. I was certainly involved in efforts to empower the African American community. And so each issue had to deal with something either myself or others were passionate about in order to get people involved and get people to follow whatever the issue was that we were trying to do. One of the things that you may not know, and people watching this program would find, I think, of interest. When I told you about demonstrating at Annapolis High School, Annapolis, Maryland is a small city, relatively small. It's a city that wasn't used to Black students demonstrating. So this should not be assumed that this was any way normal. In fact, what I'm about to describe to you illustrate just how much challenging the system created the issue. There was a program that existed in the 1970s, which was later discredited, but it affected a lot of people, myself included. It was called a COINTEL program, which means counterintelligence program. It was operated by the FBI under then J. Edgar Hoover. And what the COINTEL program was designed to do was to identify activists who happened to be Black and to, in their terms, neutralize them, to make sure that people like a Malcolm X or Martin Luther King Jr. or Fred Hampton or an Angela Davis would not emerge. And so they would identify early on young people who seemed to have some leadership qualities. So between the ages of 16 and 22, the FBI opened up a file on me, a dossier, and followed me around and spied upon me and kept me under surveillance between the age of 16 and 22. And we were able to successfully sue the FBI in the late mid 70s. And we won in a federal court because the courts concluded that the FBI had illegally spied upon me. So I was able to get my FBI file and record. And I saw what the FBI did to individuals, young people. When I was actually expelled from Annapolis High School as a result of being involved in the demonstration. I would later go to a private school called the Key School, which is a liberal arts school in Annapolis, Maryland. And as a result of my political activism, they interviewed my mother, they interviewed my father, they interviewed my teachers, fellow students. They gathered all this particular information on me. And what I wanted to do when we won the lawsuit against the FBI, I wanted to make sure people understood the power of government and what it can do and will do to what they call dissidents, so that people are real clear as to when you decide to become an activist, what are the kinds of things you got to be prepared for. So after we won the lawsuit, I was able to get a copy of my FBI file. And I wanted the public to know what kinds of things they were doing to a 16-year-old at that time. So I made it public. And for individuals who are watching now, if they're ever interested in seeing what the FBI did to a 16-year-old person, they can do so merely by going to the Maryland chapter of the American Civil Liberties Union. I donated the complete file to them. So you can go to the website of the ACLU in Maryland, look at the FBI file for yourself, and you can see the kinds of things that the FBI spent taxpayers' money on in terms of keeping me and others under surveillance. So that exists.
Wow.
And I believe I was the first Marylander to successfully sue the FBI and get access to my FBI file.
Wow. Why do you think when they were interviewing everybody in your life that it never got back to you?
Well, at that time, and it's probably still true today, if someone from the FBI comes to interview someone and says, this is confidential, please don't share this with anyone, particularly the subject being me, I think there was a desire on the part of people to be cooperative with the government and not share the information. I think I mentioned to you that my own mother was interviewed by the FBI, and I didn't know until years later that she had been interviewed.
Wow.
And how I found it out was, remember I told you I got access to the FBI file, and in it showed that she had been interviewed. So I asked my mother, why didn't you tell me this? And she said, because they told me not to. It was that simple. She considered it to be patriotic to follow what the FBI was doing. And they had also told her they were doing this because it was in my best interest, and they wanted to make sure that I didn't get in trouble and that sort of thing.
Okay, wow, that's a very amazing story. My next question is just more about the current issues today. So with the ongoing issues of police brutality, which has obviously been going on for way longer than just today, but the recent murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, how have you continued your activism through the COVID-19 pandemic and quarantine with more limitations on in-person gatherings and just things like that?
Well, first of all, the murder of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd have had thousands of people in person on the streets of America. It has not been something that has stopped people from protesting. In fact, just the opposite. People risk their lives to make a statement. So I've been part of demonstrations where thousands of people have been on the streets wearing masks, practicing social distance to their ability to do so, but making it clear that they would put their lives on the line, because the number of young people and Black people who've been murdered by the police is just despicable. And there are people who feel very passionate about these issues and are willing to be on the front line, even during a pandemic. Now, what we're doing by way of Zoom is also a technique that's being used to keep organizing, even during a pandemic. So there've been the use of technology to be able to make a point, but it has not been at the expense of people not being on the streets. I think that would be a misnomer. I think that's not the case. At the time we're doing this recording, there was a murder of a young Black man in Columbus, Ohio, who was shot in his back. And while national television does not show people on the streets because it hasn't got the same attention as George Floyd did, believe me, people on the streets. And when these shootings, unjustifiable shootings, take place, people do respond, and they are on the streets. Now, the pandemic may affect the number of people that's on the street, but it would be a misnomer to assume that people are not on the streets. They actually are.
Thank you. What advice do you have for those who are doing virtual activism just any general advice or tips, or some people who might be in high risk, categories for the coronavirus,
Use
who want
technology.
to keep activism.
Right, you can use technology. There is lots of stuff that people can do without putting themselves physically at risk by being on the streets. One of the things, obviously, that is proven to be effective is young people using the power to vote. More young people voted this presidential election than ever before, and that number should increase. So young people knowing how to use their power of the vote is something that you can do.
Yes.
It's practical. It is something that can make a difference. But in addition to that, you can certainly do technology, be able to make your voices heard many times now and across the country. They are not having in-person meetings. They're using Zoom and other platforms. And so people should take advantage of those social platforms. A lot of the stuff that we're doing now, we use social media as a means of getting the word out. The beauty of social media is that you're able to communicate with people without having to depend on the mass media. Most people are unaware of that Gen 6. Gen 6 is a group of African Americans who were unjustly treated in Louisiana. It was young people who started that. It wasn't national civil rights leaders that made that case. It was young people using social media. And so learning how to use social media effectively for social justice is the future. It is the ability to be able to do something. And to give people an example of how, if people think creatively out of the box, they can make a huge difference. There's a man named Adam Clayton Powell Jr., who was once a congressman in Harlem, New York. And he was also a minister. And he was able to come up with a technique that worked then, and if updated today, could be just as effective. And here's what it was. During his day, segregation, racism was systemic and it was structural. No matter what your qualifications were as a Black person, I don't care what kind of degree you had, there were jobs that you were prohibited from working at. And in New York City, the telephone company would not hire Black people. I don't care what your qualifications were. You couldn't get a job there. So Adam Clayton Powell Jr., who was a minister and headed one of the largest Baptist churches in New York City, got his congregation members, some 5,000 of them, to agree to pay their telephone bill on the same day at the same time. So imagine, if you will, hundreds of people in line waiting to pay their telephone bills. Before you think that the company would be delighted to be able to get all of this extra money coming in, he had them pay their telephone bills in pennies. And so for those particular persons taking the payment and having to count literally thousands and thousands of pennies, it tied up the system. It made it impossible for that company to be able to process those payments. And as a result of that, they met with then Reverend Adam Clayton Powell and negotiated an agreement. And that's how Blacks got to be hired in New York City working at the telephone company. These strategies that have been used in the past can and should be used in the future. Economic withdrawal, knowing how to spend your money in a collective way, is an effective way of bringing about social change.
Thank you. Yes, I definitely agree with the idea of looking back into how, leaders in the past have made change and kind of modernizing those practices and those ideas in our current time. So that's a very good idea. Thank you for that. What is your opinion on defunding the police, as that's been a topic lately?
The way we use terminology is very important. One of the things that we have to understand is how to communicate, how to make sure your message is clear and concise so that you organize and energize and mobilize people for the goal. Defunding the police doesn't mean what people automatically think it means, which is we don't want a police department. But that's what the message that's conveyed. So the way one communicates is extraordinarily important. And I'll give you an example that people can relate to in this day. When Senator Sanders, Bernie Sanders, ran for president of the United States, he called himself a socialist Democrat. That's his label, that's his term. It allowed people to be able to exploit his language and his term for their benefit. Because quite honestly, there were people that didn't know what a socialist Democrat was, and it allowed others to define it. Had he run for president, called himself a Roosevelt Democrat. Roosevelt was a president that helped transform this nation. People's perception of who he was and what he was would have been far different. Language is important. We should learn how to communicate. It was Dr. King who said that when people use the term burn, baby, burn, it conjures up an image. Take that same rhyming and say learn, baby, learn, it takes on a whole different connotations. So language is important. Malcolm X understood the importance of language, how to use it effectively. So defunding the police, I don't think is a good strategy for mobilizing a broad spectrum of America, because I think what you want to do is hold police accountable. I think the idea is to make sure that the police treat citizens, regardless of their gender, their race, sexual orientation, with respect and dignity. And so defunding the police, I don't think gets that message across. And I think it allows adversaries to be able to effectively counteract by creating scenarios that really does not exist. If you talk to people in the Black community, African Americans, they're not saying they don't want police. In fact, on the contrary, they want police that are humane, that'll treat them with the respect that they're due, and also to address crime in their neighborhoods. I mean, I just think the language of defund the police is not a good strategy. And language do make a difference. It absolutely makes a difference.
It does. Going off of that, what are some changes do you believe that this country needs to make to its police forces to better protect Black lives instead of taking them and just for the ones that they do take, just kind of getting justice for them?
Police departments, like government, should reflect the people it serves very clearly. You cannot have a police department that's viewed as an occupying force, which in too many cities across the country is precisely what it's viewed as. People don't live in the neighborhood, don't live in the community, live out of state, coming in and occupying or patrolling communities. The police department ought to reflect the community it serves, like the government. They should be members of the community so that people have an opportunity to get to see them in many different lights. So anytime you saw a person who was a police officer, and the only time you saw him was when he was arresting people, then you get a kind of view of him that's different. And one of the things I tell people about, it's like reparations. When you talk about reparations, most people think reparations is not feasible. But it is, and it has happened on many, many occasions because people tend to be ignorant of their history. They don't know that the reparations is not a new concept. Most of them are unaware that Japanese Americans received reparations for being interned, as they were in the 40s, in these internment camps. Native Americans received reparations. That's what the whole treaties was about. Giving people back their land, giving them the opportunity to be self-governed. Many of those treaties were based around reparations. In fact, the concept of reparations is so part of our American society, we just don't call it reparations. If you're driving down the highway and someone hits you in your car by accident and damages your car, the first thing you do is obviously call the police. You get your insurance out, and the person who did the damage is required to make you whole again. Your car gets repaired. If you were injured, you get compensated for the injuries you sustained. Well, we Americans practice reparations every day when we're involved in car accidents. Well, the concept is no different than when you have harmed the people intentionally, deliberately. Reparations should be a means to an end. And quite candidly, if you describe reparations in a manner that people can understand, it's easy to sell. And this goes back to the point of why it's important to present a particular idea in a manner that people can see. If people watching the program, for example, there's not anyone that I know, if you told them the following scenario: you're at home with your loved one, you're not bothering anybody, you're just having a nice time. You're enjoying a meal or television or a favorite movie, and some burglars break into your home. And when these burglars break into your home, they rob you, they sodomize your significant other, they do horrible things, and they keep you tied up for 3 weeks. At the end of the 3 weeks, they say to you, "I'm so sorry, we shouldn't have done this." And they release you. And you ask the people, regardless of the race, what should happen. Most people, almost to a person, whether they are white or black, Jew or Gentile, Muslim or Christian, they would say to you, the first thing I would want to do, this person just injured me and injured my family. So I may call the police, but what I want is justice. And they would tell you, everybody would tell you they would want that. And that goes without regard to whatever the gender, the race, or the age of the person is. And then when you change that script and simply say this, well, what do you think about Black people? When we were in Africa and some people came into our continent, the mother continent, kidnapped our people, raped them, ravaged them, did these horrible things to them. And then after the end of 300 years of slavery, they say you're now free, you're emancipated. Why shouldn't Black people seek reparations and justice? Every other group of people on the face of the earth, under similar circumstances, would be asking for justice, reparation, to be made whole again. So I just think that addressing that issue.
Wow. Yes, definitely. So just in general, what were some movements in your life or moments in your life where you felt you've made the most impact as an activist?
I think in Annapolis, we have the first memorial to Martin Luther King Jr. in the state of Maryland. We built it before there was a memorial to Dr. King in Washington, D.C. We have one in Maryland, Annapolis, Maryland.
Yes.
We raised the money for it. And the thing I would say to people who are watching, one of the things we have to do is understand that no one will tell our story like we will tell it. We have to tell our own story. We have to write our own history. We have to speak for ourselves. What I loved about James Baldwin, he was a brilliant, brilliant writer. Baldwin spoke from the perspective of what it was like to be Black in America in his day. He described in graphic terms the Father next time. He talked about the kinds of struggles that he as an individual was going to. One who reads Giovanni's Rome really is reading about a Black man addressing his sexuality and what it meant to be gay in that era of his life. He never failed to speak his own truth, his own vision. Some years ago, there was a movie that was put out, and later a book, and then later a movie called The Color Purple. It was written by a woman named Alice Walker. And when that first came out, there was this huge criticism among some Black men arguing that that book, the movie, depicted Black men in an awful way. And my response was, you cannot tell somebody about their story. If Alice Walker had run into men, as she did, who were brutal, as they were, who were chauvinistic and sexist, as they were, that's her story. She has every right to tell her story, what happened to her as an individual. And that's what it's got to be for us as a people. We've got to tell our story. And we don't have a monolithic story. We have many, many stories. And so if you ask people who are in school, in college, at some university, who is James Madison? Who's George Washington? Most will be able to answer that James Madison was one of the co-signers of the Declaration of Independence, that George Washington was the father of our country, one of the founding fathers of America. But you said to those same people, tell me who Madison Washington was. And they'll look at you as, Madison who? Madison Washington. They've never heard of her. The fact of the matter is, Madison Washington is one of those great unsung heroes in African American history. When people study who Madison Washington was, they discover this is a Black man, a brilliant Black man who was a slave who wanted to be free. And he was able to free 134 people by taking over a boat, a mutiny, if you will. Well, our kids, our children, don't know that history of Madison Washington. Too many of our people don't know who Ella Baker was, another brilliant woman. If people knew who she was, they should be required to study her. And so I'm at the point in my life where I think that there are two things that we must do, and we must do it simultaneously. W.B. Du Bois talked about the double consciousness of America. And all he meant by double consciousness is that you have to understand how America works, but we're Black people. We understand each other far better than most people think we do. So we have to have this dichotomy, the way we approach life. On the one hand, we must demand from the government all the things that's due to us, equal funding, equal justice, etc. But we also got to realize there's some things that the government cannot, will not, and frankly, should not do. One of them is to raise our children. That's our responsibility. And so we have to have the wit and the wisdom to be able to teach our children their true history. Malcolm X once said, only a fool allows his enemies to teach his children their history. That's our responsibility. So when schools don't teach who Madison Washington was, when schools don't tell us the greatness of those who've come before us, we must take the responsibility of doing that. You're in North Carolina, and there's a history there. It's a rich history of Black people that's in that state. Your school, the school that you attend to, it's not by accident. You ought to read about what happened in your school during the Civil Rights Movement and how a state-funded school had to deal with a racist state government that was resisting Black people from becoming free. It is your school, or it's that state where Black people, Greensboro, did the first sit-ins. And the sit-ins were not sitting in, it was standing up for democracy. People who understood as students, they had a great responsibility. When it comes to students, what students have to understand as we get prepared, as they get prepared, is the great wisdom of a man named Whitney Young. Whitney Young once said, it is better to be prepared and not have an opportunity than to have an opportunity and not be prepared. We've got to get our people prepared to take on the new challenges of tomorrow and today. So we look at Vice President-elect Harris. She was prepared. She is prepared to be president of the United States. She's educated. She was able to put herself in a position so that should fate make her the first female president of the United States, she's capable of doing that. But she needs to understand is to the generation that will follow, it's not her victory alone. The truth of the matter is that had it not been for Shirley Chisholm, who was a Black woman out of Brooklyn, who I happened to have had an opportunity to interview and to meet and to work for a campaign. What made me love Shirley Chisholm, what made me so excited about Shirley Chisholm, you got to remember, this is 1972. I'm a young man.
Mm-hmm.
And here I'm hearing a black woman, in 1972, challenging the system, saying I could be president of the United States. I'm as qualified as any white man running. And she had to deal with, she, meaning Shirley Chisholm, had to deal with two issues all at the same time. She had to deal with the blatant racism of America that existed, but she also had to deal with sexism. She had black men telling her, you can't be president. And when she asked why, it was because of her gender. And she defied them. She had a book called Unbought and Unbossed because she did not accept the notion that because she was a woman and black, make no mistake about it, her complexion was not that of Halle Berry. She did not look like Beyonce. I'm a black woman, she said. I want to be judged not by my looks or my hair, but by my intelligence. So I love people like Shirley Chisholm who helped to set a standard that as students prepare themselves to go into the real world, they need to understand who they are and what they are. And once you do that, I think you'll be successful. I worked with Oprah Winfrey, worked at television with WJZ TV, Channel 13. And I met Oprah Winfrey before she was Oprah Winfrey. She was just a local news anchor. And without making the story too long, it's something that I think is worthwhile. She interviewed a woman one day in Baltimore on WJZ TV, which is a local television station. She was doing a program called People Are Talking. And this black woman who was older than she interviewed. The woman was relatively popular and had written a book. And when she finished the interview, she took her into the green room. And Oprah Winfrey shared with the woman the kind of troubles that she was having, just trying to make it. And the black woman told her something that Oprah never forgot, and certainly something I remember very clearly. Black woman said, your problem, Oprah, is you don't believe in God. And Oprah was shocked to hear this woman say that. Why would you say that? She said, if you believed in God, you would understand something. God makes no mistakes. There's nothing wrong with you. There's nothing wrong with your skin color. There's nothing wrong with your hair. When you try to be somebody that God didn't intend you to be, she said, you'll never be successful. Understand that God makes each person unique and individual. Accept the fact that you are okay because you're a child of the living God. The woman who gave her that advice, by the way, was Maya Angelou. And Maya Angelou is somebody I have great admiration for. She was a walking encyclopedia of wisdom. And I had an opportunity to meet her, to talk with her, and to see her wisdom. God, she was one of these. If I had any choice for any student, I'd require them to sit and listen to Maya Angelou, just to listen to her wisdom. What a brilliant woman. She walked with Martin Luther King Jr. She marched with Dr. King. She worked for Malcolm X, which people don't know that. She was an incredible bridge between yesterday and today. And the wisdom she shared then is as important then as it is now. So read, study, read, study, read, study, read, study, and write, and write, and write. I just finished writing a book, publishing a book myself. And it's just important that we tell our own story. And the more we write, the more we speak, I think the more effective we will be in giving guidance to the next generation.
Yes, it's good. It's great that you bring up your book because that's actually where I wanted to go next. And this year you released your book of your opinion columns titled "Some People Watch Clocks to Tell What Time It Is. I Watch People to Know What Time It Is." So I love the title. And so I would love to ask what prompted you to write this book, and what made you, or what made now the right time to do so? And then also, what's the meaning behind the title as well?
My mom passed this year. My mother lived to be almost 105 years old. The book was
Wow.
dedicated to her. Her wisdom, her perseverance was so incredible. My mother was a living history. Not many people get to live in five. She had all of her faculties
Right.
with her. So when people would say to her, "Nothing's changed in America," my mother would go bonkers because she lived before women had the right to vote. She lived long enough to see a Black man become president of the United States. In her lifetime, she saw the assassinations of so many of our people, and she saw the progress that was being made. So one of the things I wanted to do, I've been advocating that people practice what they preach or preach what they practice. And I've been preaching that people need to write. And so I want to make an example by writing my own views on what happens. The title, "Some People Watch Clocks, I Watch People." If you pay attention to people, you can learn a great deal. If you look at a clock, it tells you what time it's supposed to be. If you watch people, you'll know what time it is, because time is relative. You know, you can hear people saying things in 2020, the year 2020, but they sound like it's 1920 because of who and where they're stuck at. If you pay attention to people, you'll know something. And here's an example. You've heard the expression, I'm sure, "I can't breathe." And if you ask the average person, where does that expression come from, "I can't breathe"? Some will quickly tell you it came from Eric Garner in 2014 when he was apprehended by a police officer in New York City. And he uttered the words, "I can't breathe." Others will tell you, well, I remember when George Floyd, with the police with his foot on his neck, shouted, "I can't breathe." And so some would think that "I can't breathe" is part of the 21st century lexicon. It is not. The first time the words "I can't breathe" was uttered, they were uttered on a slave ship coming from the motherland, where men and women were like sardines packed in the bottom of a cargo ship. They were chained and were not able to relieve themselves. So women whose periods came on, those periods came on. Men who defecated on themselves, they were in the hull of this cargo ship. They didn't speak the same language. They came from the same continent, but they did not speak the same language. Some spoke Swahili, others spoke their native tongue, but they couldn't communicate with each other. But they all said in unison, in their own languages, "I can't breathe." The stench that existed there. And so if you really want to know where "I can't breathe" come from, you got to know your history. You got to know those Africans that were in the cargo ship. If you ever go to New York City and go to a place called Ellis Island, there is a Statue of Liberty, which is, by the way, patterned after a Black woman. But if you look at the base of that particular Statue of Liberty, there's this term that is used: "Give me your huddled masses yearning to breathe free." We have a whole history in this country of people trying to breathe free. And so the civil rights movement and the movement that preceded that and the movement that we're currently in is symbolically about a movement of people trying to breathe free. When you're not able to walk the streets as a man or woman of color without fear that someone will kill you merely because of the color of your skin, you cannot breathe free. There is a statement that Dick Gregory once made that's so powerful and it's so true. Dick Gregory said, if you're driving down the highway and suddenly this siren goes off and police lights begin to flash behind you, Dick Gregory says you instinctively tightened up on that steering wheel.
Mhm.
Frightened to know that if you get stopped, who knows what might happen. And when the police officer goes by you, Dick Gregory says, you find yourself saying, thank God.
Mhm.
And Dick Gregory said, thank God for what? You didn't do anything. And he's so right. But that gives you some sense of what it's like to be Black in America, where merely because somebody turns on the siren, you instantly have this fear. And so we have our children,
Wow.
you know, who find themselves frightened. And here's an example. President Barack Obama and others would tell you that if you have a teenage daughter or son and it's midnight, whether it's midnight in Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, Mississippi, or
Mhm.
midnight in North Carolina, and someone stops you, a police officer stops you at night, that police officer says to your child, your young person, calls them names, racially insults them, treat them with less than respect, and the police officer says to you to shut the F up, and you ask your adults, you ask your parents, you ask your guardians, what should you do? They will tell you, keep quiet. And you say, why? And they say, well, the reason we want you to keep quiet is we love you. And we know that if you say anything to this officer, it may result in you dying. And they got plenty of examples. Sandra Bland, Michael Brown, Freddie Gray,
Mhm.
George Floyd. And most people think when elderly people, like President Obama, gives that advice to young people, it's good advice. I respectfully disagree. And here's the reason why. This is 2020. If you ask the same scenario 100 years ago of Black people who were the guardians of young people, what should they do in those circumstances? They would say the exact same thing. Keep quiet, don't say anything. That was in 1920.
Right.
1820, they told us the same thing. 1720,
Mhm.
1620. Stokely Carmichael, a hero of the civil rights movement, once said the following: our fathers and our grandfathers, when they saw racism, would run in the opposite direction, but they didn't want to get in any trouble. He said to
Mhm.
Martin Luther King Jr. in the 60s, my grandfather ran, my great grandfather ran, my father ran. This generation's out of breath. We ain't running no more. And so the notion is we shouldn't be telling our children, keep your mouth shut, survive the moment. We should be telling our children and teaching them we've got to change America so that because you're Black or brown, you are expected to keep your mouth shut when racist people treat you with disrespect. Now, that's not the kind of
Mhm.
America we should be teaching our children to live in. We should be
Right.
encouraging them to do everything they can to tear down the structure that makes it possible for a Black person to be treated in an insulting manner simply because they're Black.
Mhm. Wow. Thank you for sharing that. Just to, before we wrap up, I would like to ask just what general advice do you have for young students who want to get involved in civil rights and civil rights activism? And I know in an interview with History Makers, you said one of your favorite quotes is, no one can do everything, but everyone can do something.
That's right.
So yeah, I just wanted to ask what advice you have for students who want to get involved.
That would be part of it. For everyone should find something that they can do because everyone can make a
Mm-hmm.
contribution. It's not necessary to
Mm-hmm.
be the leader, but it's necessary to make a
Mm-hmm.
contribution. Um, the three things I would say as we close this up, particularly for college students, know your history, read, take the
Right.
opportunity to learn. Learn. It's so important to know your history. Once you understand your history and your place in that history, and who you are, you will be successful, because part of what has kept many people from being able to achieve their dreams and hopes is the ignorance of their history. I mentioned to you earlier Madison, Washington, which I'm guaranteed that most people have never heard of who he is, uh, but he's as important as Frederick Douglass was, or Harriet Tubman, who lived during the same era. We've got to teach our children their history. Um, it is still true. It is still true to this very day that one of the things that we must say to each other, we must encourage each other. We started off this conversation with language, and I want to end on that because I think young people need to understand how important it is to control the language. I came out of a generation where when we saw one another, even though we didn't know each other, we could be from any parts of the world, or in this case, the United States. If we saw a fellow African American, man or woman, we referred to them as brothers or sisters. How you doing, sister? How you doing, brother? In the 80s, that language changed, in the 90s. And so it's not unusual on a college campus, for example, for a college student to refer to one of his colleagues, if he's a male, as a dog. Hey, my dog, what's up, dog? Hey, gangster. Or to refer to a woman in a terminology that is disrespectful. So controlling language is important. We ought to be careful what we say to one another, how we say it. Our words should be words of encouragement, designed to build people up, not tear them down. When we listen to music, be careful the language that's in the music we're listening to. It's one thing to be called a derogatory name, but it's something else to dance to that very derogatory name. It means that you've accepted somebody else's definition of who you are as a woman. And that is very important that women understand that language and what you allow people to call you and what you call yourselves is important. You're not doing a fellow woman, a girl, a woman, a favor if you called her the B word. And she's not your friend if she's calling you the B word. It's a terminology that we need to learn how to speak to one another where we empower each other, not tear each other down. And lastly, we've got to get beyond this notion of color. We've got to understand that African American people come in every color, every color. Oh, yeah. And the beauty of that is that we reflect humanity. We're the only group of people on the face of the earth where if you made us with any other group, we will always come up with ourselves. If you take the universal number 9 and you multiply 9 by any whole number, you always come up with 9. 9 times 9 is 81. 8 plus 1 is 9. 9 times 2 is 18. 8 plus 1 is 9. Any whole number multiplied by 9 will give you that number. African American people the same way. You have made us with any group of people. The byproduct in this country of that child is going to be black. I don't care what race the other race is. If it's Vietnamese and black, it's going to be considered a black child. If it's white and black, it's going to be considered a black child. We are an incredible people who represent all that humanity has to offer. There's not a single color in the race, human race, that is not reflected in the black community, which is why you can run into black people who look like they're white, literally, but they're black. And you can go down to black people who, of course, are so dark that they look like they're blue, but we're all part of that humanity. And once we understand how great we are as a people and our humanity, we will be so much better off. So thank you for this opportunity to have this chat with you. Hopefully someone will have gotten something out of it.
Yes, I know I did. Thank you so much for everything you shared. And my favorite takeaway was definitely that, I can't be content in my education that I receive at school. Like, I need to step beyond and continue to dig deeper and, read about my history always. So Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you for being here today. And you definitely shared amazing stories, and I'm just in awe. So thank you.
Thank you.
This message has been brought to you by the National Black Leadership and Empowerment Project.